Okay, I'm going to get started. Welcome everyone to my dissertation defense for an exploration of the path for African American women too, and the diversification of the corporate boardroom. Of course, I want to take a moment and express my appreciation to my committee. Thank you for your time and your contributions. You have been extremely valuable in helping me reach this point. Thank you again. Of course, today I'll go through the entire 5 chapters of the dissertation, and to get started with chapter 1, the introduction of a statement of the problem. Women are the majority in the U.S., equal numbers to men in the workforce. Breadwinners in over 40% of our homes control up to 80% of the consumer purchasing power and outperform men in higher educational attainment, and there have parity with men in the areas of accounting and finance degrees that are key credentials for the corporate boardroom. The notion of normal, keep in mind today, is commonly accepted as typical or otherwise what is expected, to where the normal of the corporate boardroom is co-constructed by the traits of being a male of European descent. And the women in the Fortune 500 have been found to comprise less than 25% of the senior and executive leadership positions that are imperative for the path to the boardroom. And women of color have been found to be even more challenged in this regard. And to specifically address African American women, they have a distinctive complement of trials leading to the intersecting challenges of race and gender here in the United States. In other words, the unique challenge of being a Black woman in America. The prerequisites for our corporate boardroom directorships include the social capital that stem from the networks that result from these executive positions that I mentioned here just previously that women seldom obtain. So the leaders in our boardrooms can be rather oblivious to the obvious, and the obliviousness for those in the majority is that their normal can be somewhat oppressive and biased, and the obvious for those in the minority is that they are absent from the C-suite, they are absent from the boardroom, and this is particularly the case regarding African American women. To our, our directors in our boardrooms, while there may be one or perhaps two, more often than not, there are no African American women in our boardrooms. And this is, so the leaders who are there, they do not necessarily see a problem. They see their normal. And this, I submit, is the problem. So the resulting bias and rejection of the European American leaders' normal is obstructing the equitable representation of African American women in the traditionally European American male dominated space of our corporate boardroom. And here at the bottom of the slide, I show statistics from 2018 for the boards of the Fortune 100, where African American women have been found to represent 3.4% of the director seats, while they represent 7% of our population. European American men, over 61% of the seats, but only about 29 to 30% of the population. So this illustrates some of the situation. And of course, as we go deeper into the Fortune list, the Fortune 500 and on down to the Fortune 1000, we'll find the representation for African American women to grow smaller, and that of European American men will grow larger. So our research questions explore how do African American women, European American women, and European American men, corporate board directors, what I'm calling our directors of inquiry, perceive their awareness of race and gender with regard to African American women achieving corporate board director opportunities. And we further explore how whiteness and maleness are perceived to influence corporate board opportunities for African American women, how the directors of inquiry influence the path of ascension to the boardroom, and finally, what leadership strategies are employed to support African American women reaching the boardroom. The purpose of the study explored the dynamics surrounding the path and obstacles to better enable the African American woman to translate her performance into a workplace image to gain the necessary exposure to further facilitate a matrix of opportunity to realize her talents in the boardroom. The significance of the study explores how the European American androcentric normal perpetuates an obliviousness that impedes African American women from the networks and positions that facilitate directorships. Peterson and colleagues discuss how today's research finds an abundance discussing women and minorities, but very little focusing specifically on the African American woman. Collins and Thomas speak to the historical legacy impacting the current day reality for African American women that demands research to better understand her unique circumstances. And finally, the added complexities of race, ethnicity, and gender all add the added complexities that support the notion to research minorities separately, as careers vary in key ways based on these demographics. Our theoretical framework is composed of, first, obliviousness, and this is being unmindful or unaware, and where European Americans can be rather oblivious to the realities of race because whiteness is often perceived as ordinary or normal. And then the networking theories speak to the networking that facilitates directorship pipelines that are otherwise less available. And then finally, Black feminist thought that addresses the African-American woman's experiences throughout the United States history, where there's this historical legacy of bias, racism, and oppression that are not necessarily from the distant past, but part of her reality permeating her day-to-day activities from home to work and throughout the institutions of her daily life. And here, the limitations of the study involves or includes the theories that are used to explain and shape questions asked. We also limitations regarding my participant pool, their influences and experiences, and then the social dynamics of here recent events, particularly COVID-19, and then what we've seen this summer. And then, of course, the time available to both the researcher and the participants. And finally, also the limitation to my network that facilitated my selection of directors for participants. To briefly review the literature, I'll first start with women in leadership. And the challenge of women in leadership is not solely a US concern. It's been found, of course, to be globally. And then Smith and colleagues note how Black women in leadership in particular can be both visible and invisible in their difference, and that they have largely been excluded from executive management research. The history of corporate boards, the literature discusses, dates back to the first companies that were set up to colonize the Americas. And then, of course, for the US, the SEC was formed in the 1930s to further regulate corporate entities. And then key periods of corporate governance reform include the 1970s, followed by the late 1990s, and then more recently, the global financial crisis of 2008 that particularly illustrated how there needed to be more diversity in our boardrooms. But nevertheless, Brown finds that boards tend to instill only enough diversity to avoid criticism. The literature speaks to board culture being traditionally cordial with unwritten rules, influencing how boardroom composition goes about. And there, Elms and colleagues find this to be a subject of limited investigation, where the process can vary amongst companies, and there's a certain amount of a lack of clarity behind what exactly drives those selection activities. And to that point, though, the CEO and the chair, the literature discusses, are key influencers for diversity in the boardroom, and there needs to be at least one of these roles that are interested in diversity, otherwise it's very unlikely to happen. And then regarding board decision-making and governance, corporate failures over the last couple of decades has garnered a greater interest in this topic, but still there's the misperception that African-American women in particular brings less value as board members. But here again, diversity has been found to promote stronger trust in leadership and ultimately influencing corporate firm performance to the positive. Regarding board networks, of course, Chisholm Burns discussed how the demands of the woman's normal facilitates less opportunities for her to develop the necessary networks for the boardroom. And education, of course, was once believed to be an equalizer, propelling more women into leadership roles, but this just simply hasn't been the case. And then regarding the benefits of gender diversity on boards, agency theory suggests that diversity increases board effectiveness. Toomey and Peral discuss market awareness and shareholder trust and finds that diversity increases is a positive influence on both. And then finally, Hill and colleagues note that the most valuable natural resources is that of diverse knowledge and skills, which of course is automatically available with the ethnic gender diversity of African-American women. And then finally, regarding opportunities for new research, Peterson, Chisholm Burns, Cook and Glass, and Northouse all discuss how race, ethnicity, and gender add that greater level of complexity and supports the notion that we should research African-American women separately from her peers. And of course, that's what this study seeks to do. To go into my methodology, Of course, I chose a qualitative phenomenological approach, and the rationale here is that Creswell and Poth discusses how this is ideal to address social problems to gain understanding by focusing on the participants' perspectives. The clerk also notes how this is ideal for new topics with limited published research and the underexplored areas of quantitative research. Of course, African American women in the boardroom is one of the underexplored areas, and then studies regarding the boardroom tend to be quantitative, testing the relationship of diversity to various quantitative metrics that seeks to transition the question of why into a testable hypothesis that can lack a certain amount of clarity. So the qualitative phenomenological approach is available to us to explore lived experiences to better understand the why from the perspectives of those living the reality. Now, as far as the role of the researcher, the literature discusses how, and Jay in particular notes how the researcher is central and often underpinned by a constructivist paradigm of the various worldviews and paradigms. Now, I may find my toes step into many of them, but the constructivist paradigm fits me the best. And also the literature discusses where I should use bracketing to remain true to the information that surfaced. I think I did this fairly well. And as part of that, of course, I leveraged reflexivity. And obviously I'm a European American male. I'm in my mid-50s. I recognize a certain insider status with my male participants due to similarities in demographics. And of course, on the flip side, there's some dissimilarities with my female participants due to the difference in demographics. And also there's an outsider status with all my participants because while I have served on boards, I have not served on a board for an organization listed on a publicly traded stock exchange. And of course, there are some key differences between the two. So I must remain, and I think I did fairly well, cognizant of the differences as well as the similarities with my participants. Also, the literature discusses how qualitative phenomenological approach should utilize at least 3 to 25 participants. Of course, as you recall from the proposal defense, we settled on 12, and here I have 3 equal groups for my directors of inquiry. I also utilized a preliminary questionnaire to verify that my participants met the criteria for my study, which ultimately boils down to be serving on 1 or more corporate boards for organizations listed on publicly traded stock exchanges. And then regarding data collection, Marshall and Rossman discussed the 4 methods. I leveraged their insights to help me in this regard. And of course, Creswell and Poth also discussed the interview process and protocols. And here, while I initially had planned to have in-person, face-to-face interviews, given the COVID situation, we transitioned that to virtual interviews using Zoom or WebEx. And additionally, I utilized Butterfield's enhanced critical incident techniques to bring some additional guiding principles. And one of these that you see on the screen is wish list items, which I will address more in later slides. Creswell also discussed data analysis. I used these insights to help me organize and prepare the data. In doing so, of course, I reviewed and coded the data with short phrases to help me organize the data into the themes that eventually emerged. And in doing so, I went through several iterations to get to the ultimate themes that I used. And of course, I used these themes to help me form my qualitative narrative to discuss the findings of my study. And then also Creswell and Poth discussed validation strategies. And of course, in my dissertation, you can read about my worldview. I clarified my biases there. And again, this involves engaging in reflexivity. The data sources I used for my study include, of course, my interview transcripts. I also utilized my preliminary questionnaire that captured demographic information as well as my participants' board experience. And also my questionnaire had a critical incident that I posed to my participants. They answered that, and I used that as insight as well. And then finally, I used my participants' professional profiles available to the public. And of course, Creswell and Poth also discussed utilizing member checking, and my participants were extremely graceful, accommodating in this regard, where they reviewed the transcripts, they gave me feedback, they also reviewed my themes and other information I sent to them for their insights. And of course, I used all this to describe my findings with rich, thick content. And here at the bottom, you see the 9 credibility checks from Butterfield. As I went through it, in the end, I went through and checked off each one to ensure I met them in one fashion or another. And then finally, now to move on into my findings. Here, I show my participants, and the names that you see in my participant list are names that I assign my participants to protect their identity. These names come from my family members and friends of various generations. And the inspirational names for Faith, Hope, Grace, and Joy I found fitting for the African-American women, Emma, Kelly, Angie, and Jamie, the European-American women, and then finally Victor, Olin, Leon, and Carlin for the European-American men. The themes that emerged are 3 main themes you see here on the screen, as well as the sub-themes, and I'll go through these briefly regarding boardroom composition drivers. As the literature suggested, my participants discussed how this varied from board to board, and Victor, of course, said what works for one board may not work for another. I found a multitude of influencers influencing boardroom composition, and to go through these briefly, the nomination and governance committee, that really emerged for me as a new finding compared to what I found in the literature. Their central role in preparing that slate of directors for the board to consider. They are among the first to drive the process, led by the committee chair. As Jamie said, the best way to get on a board is through the people who make the decisions, and this committee is really at the forefront of doing so. And then regarding the most influential factors, of course, network was found to be extremely important. As Joy said, you have to be part of the right network so you get the call. And then ultimately, skills and credentials will really make the selection, and where Carlin said it's somebody coming in that does not replicate what we already have on the board. As far as the most advantageous career path to the boardroom, of course, the CEO was often referenced, but also accounting, finance, and operations were expertise that was found advantageous. But at the end of the day, throughout all my participants, it kind of varied across the various C-suite positions and other key positions in the organization, where Leon said he didn't think there was a particular most advantageous career path. And Joy, you have to have proven corporate experience. Of course, the literature discussed the role of the board chair and the CEO in influence and diversity in the boardroom. And Faith found the CEO to be the one to set the tone. Carlin found it to be the board chair. Of course, Jamie found both had to have guts and say, I want an African-American woman on my board. And then regarding how my directors of inquiry or directors in general influence opportunities for African-American women. African-American women directors, Joy said, she didn't know if they actually had that much influence now because of their limited numbers in the boardroom. Of course, Faith recognized that they would be the ones most likely to bring other African-Americans to the boardroom. Regarding the influence of European-American women directors, Faith said that they have a vested interest in seeing more women on boards, but Grace recognized how they have to be more cautious because of the added burden of gender, that whoever she would recommend, she has to ensure that they're going to be successful. And then, of course, finally, European-American men directors were found to have the most premier importance due to their numbers. And here Joy said, white women or black women get to the top because white men say so. And then regarding critical mass influence in boardroom composition, the actual number varied amongst my participants. 2 was found to be probably the number for small boards, being 5 seats or less, and then 3 for boards of larger size. And most aligned with Olin in recognizing that a greater presence promotes more of the same. And then the importance of networks and networking were found to be extremely important. But of course, as I went through my various participants, it kind of varied to different degrees. But Angie recognized networks will get the door open for someone to talk to. Then skills versus needs. Of course, the CEO and the CFO were the most referenced skills. But again, it kind of varied across all the key positions in the organization. And Leon recognized that it's the skill sets that we don't think we have adequate, or that will be requiring, or that will be opening up in the near future due to retirements and so forth. And then regarding diversity drivers for the boardroom, of course, the business case is often mentioned, and Olin here said that the reason for women in the boardroom is their diversity of thought and experience, and you just can't replicate that. Then it was recognized too how boards had to have intentionality for diversity in the boardroom. And Joy said you have to articulate a need, a vision, like you would do anything else where you're trying to make money. And then finally, how diversity drives diversity. That was a comment that emerged often, and Hope recognized that more is only going to develop greater networks and greater opportunities for women. And then the third theme here, gender dynamics. Of course, there's dynamics that are kind of universal for all women regardless. And Leon recognized that for years, a lot of corporations didn't afford women the right opportunities so they could reach the boardroom. And then as I asked questions, I would ask often, how did it vary for African-American women? And oftentimes initially there may be the comment that there was no difference, but of course as the interviews went on and elaborated, there was some difference that emerged. And here Grace recognized that there's often a black tax that comes into play. And it was recognized that African-American women can be lost in the term women by itself. And then regarding the, here I showed the dynamics for African-American women and getting into some of those details. And one of those is networks, and where African-American women are found to have less expansive networks. And Grace commented how that when she's been at board conferences, that she oftentimes didn't have European Americans come up to her and seek to have additional conversations after the conference or invite her to the dinners that took place and so forth. Regarding career pipelines and the glass ceiling, oftentimes opportunity for African-American women, they were excluded before the opportunity was really in sight. And this, Joy asked, how do we cultivate Black women to take on bigger roles in organizations? And then the dynamic of diverse slates and the difficulties for African-American women. Hope said that she didn't know if a person in the majority would be as quick to ask for a diverse slate. And she found this to be a role that she played in her board to ensure that they did receive that diverse slate, particularly when search firms were involved. And then regarding legislation, how that makes a difference. Of course, most recognize that legislation was increasing diversity to some extent. Of course, throughout all my female participants in particular, they were concerned about quotas and how that can give the wrong impression that the only reason why a woman's there, and particularly a Black woman, is because a number had to be met. And then finally here, directors and their influence on the path for African-American women to the boardroom. Again, the European American male director was found to have key influence. And here they have credibility with their male peers. So people will give you a chance, fate said, if you've been nominated by a white male. And then now moving on to chapter 5 to discuss my conclusions. Of course, the alignment of my findings regarding the central question of how my directors of inquiry perceive their awareness. All of the participants, particularly the African-American women participants, were aware of the role that race and gender have in corporate board opportunities. They recognized the challenge for the pipeline. They also identified with doing the work and obtaining the skills, but oftentimes not being rewarded with the positions and the titles. The European American women participants too recognized how diversity or race comes into play. They recognized the gender dynamics that can be obstacles, and they were aware that the African-American woman was not present in the boardroom circles that she otherwise navigates, or not present in significant numbers. And then finally, the European American men, you heard comments, and of course this could be universal across all my participants, that it's the same process for all. And they also recognize that that same process presents the recognition that race and gender can present obstructions to opportunity. Then the contributions to the body of knowledge in this area, my study really illuminated the varying lived experiences of my corporate board directors. And again, from the comment that it's the same process for all, which it is regarding the mechanics of the process, to how that same process can present obstacles, particularly for African-American women. And also illuminated how corporate boards have to be more intentional to seek out diversity where it finds home and comfort. And here on the flip side, African-American women themselves have to be more intentional to seek boardroom opportunities and be willing to expand their networks. And then finally, our corporate board influencers overall must expand their view of where board-ready talent exists and what that looks like exactly. Regarding sub-question 1 about how whiteness and maleness comes in, is perceived to influence corporate board director opportunities for African-American women. Of course, the process is heavily influenced by the current corporate board directors and their networks. And with most American corporate boards being predominantly European American males, the nom-gov chair, along with the board chair and the CEO, are often the same. And as Joy commented, white women or black women get to the top because white men say so. This is the essence of the influence of whiteness and maleness in the process. And the contribution here is that the nom-gov component really emerged as being instrumental in that diverse slate, in addition to the role of the CEO and the board chair in my study. And of course, it also was greatly illuminated how networks are imperative to be considered. Of course, this is echoed in the literature. And here, additionally, how skills and credentials are really imperative and considered looking for the match in current needs and gaps, that this will ultimately drive the final selection. Regarding sub-question 2, how my directors of inquiry or directors in inquiry influence the path of ascension to the boardroom. Of course, regarding African-American women, as more reach the boardroom, their networks will drive more opportunity for other African-American women. And then regarding European American women directors, they will continue offering opportunity just simply by their presence. They recognize diversity is necessary for boards to best serve their stakeholders, and they also recognize diversity is the right thing to do. Now, the right thing to do is not lost upon the European American male directors. They too recognize the enriching diversity that is often underrepresented on our boards today. But due to their numbers, of course, they will be either a driver of or a barrier to the change upon us. And the contributions here for the body of knowledge, of course, the need for African-American women to be intentional in her networking really came forth in this study. And that includes the European American male, and she must be willing to network outside of her comfort zone. And as Jamie said, put a strategic plan together. And this study illuminated how the nom-gov chair and committee are really should be part of that strategic plan in addition to the board chair and the CEO. And of course, on the flip side, all demographics on our corporate boards today, particularly that of the European American male, they must also be intentional in how they network for the boardroom, network outside of their normal, and be willing to consider this to adequately fulfill their responsibilities as sitting directors, and particularly regarding a robust succession plan. Now, finally here regarding question 3, what leadership strategies are employed? Joy suggested that the corporate strategy has to be specific regarding diversity. Victor recognized too that it has to be incorporated at the board director level or board director selection process itself. And then Kelly called for acknowledging the specific need for the diversity of African-American women in our boardrooms. So in the end, corporate directors must network with those seeking boardroom opportunities, allowing the African-American woman to grow her networks and knowledge of corporate board dynamics. And here the contribution that we have from this question is the importance of a robust succession plan. That was really illuminated by my participants' experiences, and how also the importance of a corporate strategy we must have that recognizes diversity as part of that robust succession plan. Now, how my theoretical framework aligns with my findings, of course, regarding obliviousness, this comes into play by the array of the varying dynamics that keeps corporate boards and their influencers unaware of the full array of needs, skills, and gaps, including the diversity of African-American women or others. What boards must do, where they must look when the talent needed is not in their networks. And finally, what must take place to ensure the pipeline exists to support a succession plan that is truly robust enough. Regarding networking, of course, this is equivalent to a two-way multi-lane highway that exposes boardroom talent to the boardroom and the boardroom itself to talent that is available. Either side of this equation, if they miss the opportunity to develop these robust networks, we will be disadvantaged in the ultimate goal of a board being the most productive for its organization. And then finally here, regarding Black feminist thought, the realities of this comes into play within recognition that African-American women have to be unicorn-like to make it feel right to be selected. Joy made this comment. And also, at best, there's a certain bias that realizes the deficiency in the pipeline regarding African-American women to the boardroom. There's also the anything but Black sentiment that emerged in the Black tax. These are comments that Grace in particular recognized. And then regarding strategies for the diversification of our boardrooms, I have 4 here. 3 are around the corporate board itself. And to touch on these briefly, regarding corporate board education programs, of course, programs exist today, particularly in our colleges and universities, but it's not necessarily universal across all colleges. So here our business colleges and our universities have the opportunity to develop more corporate board programs. And here the institutions more centered on women can do so. And that includes, of course, our HBCUs and other institutions focused on African-American women. This extends as well to our company employee development programs that provide a path for their talent to higher education. They can provide a path to these board of director programs as well. Then regarding corporate board certification programs, of course, again, programs exist today, but Emma in particular noted that oftentimes she found men to feel like women have to be certified to be competent in the boardroom. So there's organizations that help with this certification. Again, they need to focus more on African-American women to ensure she's getting the necessary visibility. And this too extends to our company employee development programs that's similar to opportunities for their employees to seek Six Sigma certification or PMI or project management certification. They can do the same regarding board of director certification. And then finally, around corporate board organizations, of course, they exist today. Organizations such as Women Corporate Directors is one of them. They focus on visibility and networking opportunities for women. So these organizations have the opportunity to focus more specifically on African-American women and provide visibility to this talent. And again, this extends to our company employee development programs that can coordinate with these organizations to help their talent in their organizations achieve this kind of recognition. And then regarding metrics, boards and their companies must maintain the necessary metrics that demonstrate the various facets of diversity, particularly as it relates to promoting a robust succession plan. And as Grace commented, organizations have to create optics on true metrics because that begins to become intentional. And then wish list items that comes from Butterfield's process. Just to touch on what these are those items that were not necessarily present during my participants' experiences, but looking back on things, these were items that would have been preferred to be in place. And so the 3 that I have listed here, strong board networks, of course, that's not surprising to have emerged as a wish list item given the necessity of trust for boards to be functional and to function well. Of course, this can find the responsibility to be on African-American women, but so too is a responsibility to be on the corporate board environment itself to ensure they have visibility to the board-ready talent. And then, of course, the wish that the diverse slates existed that included African-American women. As Angie said, the business case is there, and we must demand a diverse slate, particularly that of search companies, because it was recognized that search companies really bring back what their clients are looking for. And if they're not specifically saying they're looking for African-American women, they won't necessarily come back with that in the slate. And then finally here, the senior leadership team and the C-suite expertise. Again, this is not surprising to have emerged as a wish list item given the references to the necessity for strong networks for the boardroom as well as CEO visibility. Olin, of course, recognized that the C-suite and positions reporting to the CEO are instrumental for African-American women as it is for any candidate to reach the boardroom. And then finally here, I list 5 recommendations. I'll just touch on the first one briefly. The literature discussed a little bit about inclusion. I found some literature that addressed this area. And also inclusion came up amongst my participants, particularly the African-American women. So how does inclusion versus just diversity in the boardroom influence board composition and effectiveness of the board? That would be an area that I would consider doing more research in particular. And then finally, my conclusions from the study. The first one here regarding a robust succession plan. Corporate boards must ensure that they have a robust succession plan that includes the diversity of African-American women for anticipated as well as unanticipated needs, such as what the corporate world found after the George Floyd tragedy of this summer. Here, boards must be intentional to ensure that they have a pipeline that is inclusive and is expansive, and again, particularly regarding the diversity of African-American women. And to guarantee that we have that expansive and inclusive pipeline, at the very minimum, ask the African American women talent in our organizations, how has the pipeline, or what do they think of the status of the pipeline? How's it working for them? And if we can't find the African American woman, it's look in our networks, look in our organizations, and ask the women who are there, where do we go to find this talent? Regarding networks in the capital of European American men, of course, given the comments from the women of the study, and here I show comments for all 8 women, African American women must be intentional to network and include the key demographic of the American corporate boardroom that will occupy this crucial position for the foreseeable future, and that is European American men. And note the plural of men. The African American women must also have a multitude of African American men in their networks and board influencers in their networks, because again, they are the demographic of multitude on America's corporate boards. And again, I show here, it's the women of the study who are making these comments the most, and they are repeating these comments often. So this is not to imply that other corporate board directors and influencers are not important, because certainly they are, but for the board one is seeking a seat on, who are the essential players? If this is the European American men, then European American men it is. If it's another demographic or group, then certainly do not dismiss that demographic or that group. But at the end of the day, one must be intentional, and intentionality is appropriate for not only those seeking the boardroom, but also for those in the boardroom. And then, while networks remain most influential to have access to board opportunities, and here the capital of the European American male is crucial due to his numbers on boards today. The credentials and skills meeting the current needs and gaps of the board is the utmost importance that will realize the seat. So boards must have awareness to recognize gender diversity as a need, because that did not always come forth with my participant interviews of how that is truly a need for the boardroom. And then boards must too recognize that the diversity of African American women is part of this need. And here they must have the awareness to how the tendency to be influenced by obliviousness and the realities of Black feminist thought can kind of either influence them one way or the other, and the necessity for not only board members, but also their board networks to be aware of obliviousness in the realities of Black feminist thought and how they look at what is board-ready talent for their boardrooms. And then finally, here's some self-reflection from the study. Of course, my daughter, Michaela Quinn, she is my stimulus for my focus on women in leadership. As I started the program, it was noted that you had to have passion behind the topic for your dissertation. Of course, I thought I could find a great deal of passion around my daughter, particularly how she is or isn't disadvantaged in business. And this is comparing to her brother, which I recognized over the years that there was going to be differences and she was going to be disadvantaged just because she's a woman. Not to say that the path for her brother is easy, but definitely there's differences due to gender. So as I reviewed the literature, I found African American women to repeatedly experience bias, prejudice, and oppression in their personal and professional pursuits. So I recognized that the need and the challenge regarding women in leadership transcended the women of my family to a higher, more ethical, more moral place. So to understand and to make a difference for the Black women who call me a friend and colleague, of course, I have to be open-minded enough to better understand their world. And what you see here on this slide, there's a photo of my daughter. When she was 16, I took her on an 8-day ride up to Eastport, Maine and back. That's in, of course, Maine and New England. It's one of the most eastern cities in the US. Of course, we didn't know where we were going. Let me back up. We didn't know where we would necessarily stay or where we would eat each day. And as we went along the way, she commented to me often, "It's the people, Dad, it's the people." So the final takeaway I would say is embrace diversity, embrace difference for the new, the yet to be experienced, and learn that enhances our lives, our organizations, our countries, our world, and embrace the incredible opportunity that diversity offers us all. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll open this up now to entertain any questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Kirk. And yes, you can use your gestures to do the claps. Kirk, you may want to mute yourself because I hear echo.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you very much for a great presentation. Kirk, I'm going to kick us off, and I just have one thing I want you to mention, and then I'll open up the floor for the committee members to ask their questions and provide comments. If you could you talk a little bit about your limitations and delimitations? Because I didn't catch that, and I want to make sure that you speak to that.
I know some of the limitations, of course, involve, or the delimitations in particular, I found to be, as far as the participants I had access to, it was really dependent upon my network and how I could leverage that network to bring in the participants. So based on my network, that was going to make a difference on who I interviewed and who I didn't. And then some of the limitations too I recognized is that just recruiting my participants, I don't know how much the COVID has really came into play and given possible participants so much work they didn't have time to participate in my study. But I reached out to a total of 85 possible participants, and it was interesting to find that it took 16 email or 16 attempts of European American men to get my 4. I think it was 25 of European American women to get my 4 European American women, of course, and then the remaining, which is what is that about 40 some attempts at African American women to get the 4 of them. So I don't know how much COVID, and particularly this summer in particular, regarding some of the social unrest that's taken place, how much that came into play, but obviously that limited participation, I believe, in my study to some degree. And of course, it was a difference between African American women, and it was less of a difference with European American women, and European American men responded. It took less attempts to get my 4 out of those. And of course, that could be some of the challenges of just the fact that I'm a white male trying to interview women, and then here, of course, white women as well as black women. So is that what you were looking for?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So now I'm going to open it up to the committee. If you all have questions, just jump on in.
Kirk, I wanted to say that you did an exceptional job with this particular study. I truly enjoyed reading it. I note that you align your findings with the research question and align your findings with the theoretical framework. Can you say how does your finding align with the literature? And if your findings were what you expected, please?
Well, the findings, the influence of the board chair and the CEO, that was a consistent alignment with my literature. The literature I reviewed, and I went back just to double check that I didn't miss this. There was about, just a very, very limited mention of the role of the non-gov committee, but my study illuminated that as being, one of the premier importance in driving that composition in the boardroom. So those are a couple of the differences. As far as my alignment with my theoretical framework, in the beginning, my first participant that I interviewed was a white male. And of course, when I heard him say it's the same process for all, that's kind of what I expected, given my experience and what I've read in the literature regarding the theoretical framework. And then as I continue interviewing women, I kept hearing that same thing. And so by the end of the study, that was a consistent comment that you'd hear across all participants, that it's the same process for all. And as I looked at my data and considered what they were saying, what I see is, and I touched on this briefly, that the mechanics of the process, I do believe is the same for everyone. But what the difference is, it's the human condition among those who are comprising that slate to be considered for the boardroom. And then as directors do consider that slate, it's just the human condition, our own influences, our biases, and so forth, our own life experiences that will have us paying more attention to some directors versus others. And that's part of that awareness that I think our boards have to have, is how much of this obliviousness, for example, how much is black feminist thought, those realities, how much does that influence? It's not the process that it's influencing, but it's influencing the decisions that the directors are making in the process, I feel. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And also, how do you plan on utilizing the information gleaned from this particular study?
Well, one of the things I was looking to do is some of the recommendations I was making regarding having more visibility, organizations developing more programs that are focusing more on African American women. I know too that particularly organizations that are just getting started with their boards, how there maybe are some opportunities to consult in that space to help them form the best boards and have the awareness of what they're looking for as they form these boards. And then with the existing boards, as one of my participants noted, she said, and she was one of the African-American women, she said that given this summer, and she's kind of new to the board space, but she said she has, since she's been in the boardroom, she has been repeatedly approached asking, who else do you know? Because they can't find the Black woman talent. Now, I think it's rather easy to find the Black woman talent, and I think it's easy if you will go to where she's at, and which is more in the areas that she finds comfort. And if you're expecting her to come to you, you know, that may happen to a small degree, but for the most part, if you are looking for good African-American women talent for our boardrooms, I think it's there. I think the women of the study will agree with that. You just have to go to where she's at if she's not coming to you.
Kirk, very much.
Thank you, Kirk, for your presentation. So I have two questions. One, what surprised you about your study?
Pardon me, I didn't quite hear that.
What surprised you about your study? What surprised you?
Well, I know in the beginning it surprised me when everyone was saying it's the same process for all. That was something I didn't really expect. But of course, as I said, I think it is the same mechanics of the process. It's just a human condition that can make it different. And then I also, I know my first African-American woman participant that I interviewed, some of the things, I guess, because of my own expectations based on what I reviewed in the literature and so forth, I didn't necessarily see some of the personal experiences that I was anticipating, I guess you could say would be an appropriate way of framing it. And so she was, in many ways, I saw an experience that wasn't that much different from what I would expect a European American woman to say. And so, but then of course, as I continue, that's the importance of having more than multiple participants, because as I continue going through the entire 12, you got the full picture of what you could expect from other directors.
Okay, my next question is, if you're giving a lecture to middle school students, they want to know a summary, give them a summary about your study.
Well, at the end of the day, if you want to be in the boardroom, and one of the things too is, and this came forth out from my participants' comments, a lot of the women, they had never really thought about the boardroom, and some of them didn't think about it until later in their career. And they recognized that to get into the boardroom, they should have been planning for this several years earlier. And also the importance of developing networks, and here, be willing to not limit yourself based on your own expectations, but to go where, to take all the opportunities that you have to develop those networks. But at the end of the day, and what I tell a lot of people is, your network is instrumental to giving the visibility for the possibility to be in the boardroom. But if you want to be there, you have to have the right skills and credentials. And it doesn't mean that what you've done in life isn't important and isn't worthy of the boardroom, but for the board that you're seeking a seat on, do you match the gap in the needs that they identified? And so, I mean, if you do, then you have a good chance of being selected if you meet all the other criteria. But if you don't, then it doesn't matter what other characteristics you have. If you don't meet their gaps and their needs, you're most likely you're not going to get accepted regardless of what your network is. And I believe see, Victor Olin, it was Carlin who commented on that particularly. He said, if you don't meet a gap that we have in the boardroom, your network's not going to do you any good. So I would say focus on network. And actually for women, oftentimes I will say, be intentional in your network and make sure you're connecting with people that not only you can add value to, but perhaps more importantly for her is that she can get value comes to her, and not just do it just for the fun of the networking, but be intentional and make sure you're networking with people who can connect you with the right players if you want to be in the boardroom. So,
all right, thank you.
Okay.
Kirk, I think you have done an excellent job with your research. You've done all of this research now, and so moving forward, what kind of key components would you put in place to help change the diversity dynamic with all of this insight that you've already researched and gained?
Well, you know, we have the opportunity, most organizations have the opportunity to get insight with how they comprise their boards from their own members in their organization. So, and this was one of the things, I really don't recall now if it was in my literature or if it came from one of my participants, but it commented how, you know, we need to not only ask, you know, the people in the boardroom and the people who are really drive the board selection, but also involve our employees in the organization about possible candidates for the boardroom. And that would be another way to open it up. And then of course, if you open that up to you know, a key part of your employee base, then that can bring new insights to additional directors that you may not consider and help you flesh out that diverse slate.
And my other question is, if you had to pick one finding that came out of your research, what would you say had the most impact? What finding had the most impact in implementing change for the future?
You know, I think the role of the Nomination and Governance Committee, you know, it seems intuitive given the name. And one of the findings was particularly as we continue to utilize, and one of my male directors said this in particular, he said, you know, we need to network. If you just go to your network, you'll keep getting people who are like your network. So he supported utilizing search firms more to help us ensure we're getting a good broad consideration for candidates for consideration. And also there to ensure that we're getting a good set of candidates, you know, that needs to include the variety of, I guess, from our search firms to ensure that they have incentives to make sure they bring back a diverse slate. Because Grace, I believe it may have been Grace, but one of my African-American women participants in particular, it was Grace actually. She said at one of her, at some of the board conferences that she attended, one in particular, they were in some group discussing things, and members of search companies, they say, no, who are we not to give our clients what they want? And our clients, they're not looking for diversity, they're not looking for African-American women, and so we're going to give them what they're expecting or what they want. And they didn't feel that they were the ones necessary to be driving diversity in the boardroom, that it had to come from their clients' expectations. So that was one of the areas I think that we can really make a change in ensuring amongst our nomination and governance committees as we utilize search firms to make sure they recognize that when we talk about diversity, maybe be a little bit more specific on what they expect to see. And actually there were comments where some were saying, in the non-gov committee would expect to at least have the diversity of gender. And some, I believe, said that their diversity would include African-American women specifically. And I know one participant commented that it would include African-American women as well as Hispanic men and women, because apparently those were the demographics that they didn't see coming back in their recommendations from their search companies. So intentionality around the search, I think, would be, and for the board to set the expectation explicitly, this is what we're looking to get back. And matter of fact, one of the non-gov, one of the participants noted that their non-gov, if they didn't include certain demographics coming back to them, that they wouldn't even consider their candidates.
Okay, thank you so much.
Kirk, this is Will Sparks. It's a great job. It's such a timely dissertation research project, and I appreciate your linkage and integration of your approach and your findings to your literature review. And this is more of an applied question, sort of in line with the last two questions specifically. I think you know that my business partner, Peter Browning, who's the co-author of the Director's Manual with me, is a very active board member in Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies. And Peter served on Lowe's and Nucor and, you know, Wachovia and on and on and on. He's been on, still serves on a number of boards. And his comment to me recently was that many African-American women that he knows that are current directors have gone from serving on one board to 3, 4, in one case, even 5 boards of Fortune 500 companies. So if you can imagine you're serving on 5 Fortune 500 boards, that's more than a full-time job, and it certainly comes with a nice full-time compensation. But his comment was, the other part of that comment was, making sure that we do sort of have that talent pipeline and we have that awareness out there, because it's easy for a company to go, oh, we know Sue. So yeah, let's ask Sue to come over here and be on our board as well. And so how do we broaden the pipeline for African-American women so that there's a broader pool, so that there's more equity across the board, and you don't have a select few that are holding 4 or 5 directorships with Fortune 500 companies, and that it's more equally distributed?
Yep, what you're talking about, women, particularly African-American women serving on multiple boards. The thing that actually impacted one of my potential participants, she was interested in participating in my study, but she just never could find the time to get back to me. And she serves on multiple boards now, and I think she continues to be asked to serve on boards. But I think one of the ways to address that is, one of the participants noted how women oftentimes, they don't necessarily talk in what she called board vernacular, and how the resumes for women doesn't necessarily communicate their value for the boardroom, but they have the expertise. And oftentimes, because women, and particularly African-American women, will be funneled off into other career paths that do not necessarily support the boardroom, at the end of the day, this participant was saying that, women, they have the skills. They may have been a president of a division, but that division, for example, may have had 300 people, may have had a multi-million-dollar budget, and they were doing all the things that a CEO does, but their position didn't say they were CEO, or they could have been leading a division, whatever that might have been, but they didn't necessarily have, women oftentimes don't necessarily have the positions and titles, but they're doing the work and they're doing the jobs. And so she found one of the things that she does is, as she works with other women, is to look at their experience and pull that board vernacular out of their experience and give it more visibility. So that goes back to, we have great women talent in our organizations. They just don't necessarily have the titles that represent what they've done in business. And so that's one of the things we can do more is, and actually that was mentioned among my participants, male and female both, is that one question was, how do we go deeper into an organization? I believe this was, Olin made this comment, how do we go deeper into an organization, perhaps 2, 3, 4 levels below the CEO, and find that great board ready talent? And if we can do that, that's where women in particular, if we're not looking for the CEO title or the CFO title, and we're looking for what they actually did in their jobs, that's one of the ways we can broaden that pool and broaden that pipeline, because this was mentioned amongst from my participants, the talent's there. We just have to be willing to recognize what that is and accept that it may not be the CEO title, it may not be the CFO, and so forth. And by the way, the book you mentioned, as you saw in my dissertation, those 3 key points, do we have the right CEO? Do we have the right strategy? Or does the CEO have the right strategy? And do we have a robust succession plan? I can see how that really came into what I was finding in my study.
Hi, Kirk. I also want to commend you. Doing human research or human studies during this time is very challenging. So I commend you for the work that you have accomplished here. I have a couple of questions. Going back to your preliminary questionnaire, you had your participant criteria listed here, but in that questionnaire or during the interviews, were the participants, did they identify the paths that they took to get to the boardroom? And if so, was there any commonality that you noticed between these paths that they took?
Yeah, not necessarily the paths that they took, but as far as their credentials that they had, they all, most had a master level degree of some kind. There was a couple CPAs, a couple with law backgrounds, and then of course accounting and finance. There's a couple in that space, but as far as educational credentials, most all had, everyone had a master's degrees, and only those who didn't, they had a CPA or they had a law degree. So essentially, you know, equivalent or better. So as far as their different career paths and looking at the women, the participants of my study, you know, the men in particular, they were the most senior of my participants, and one had, you know, decades of corporate board expertise as well as being CEO and so forth in various organizations. I think the youngest of the men may not have had the decades of CEO and corporate board expertise, but they're perhaps a CFO position and those kind of roles that was important for the boardroom. The women really ranged, of course, they were younger. I guess if you go back and start looking at medium age and so forth, you'd see that the women tended to be younger. And actually, one of my Black women participants was the youngest of the 12. And their expertise, particularly the younger woman, it wasn't in the traditional, necessarily in the traditional board areas. And that was one of the things that also emerged in today's world as we continue to go forward. And as technology changes, you know, the expertise that you may need in the boardroom to give you insights in the new emerging technologies may not be in the most senior people that we typically find in boardrooms. It may be in the younger generation. So that goes back to also how it may help us broaden our candidate pool for our boardroom considerations is the talent that is needed. It may likely be younger talent going forward in many cases. For example, cybersecurity and other digital expertise that, you know, I don't have those expertise in the digital space compared to, for example, my daughter. She has an abundance of expertise compared to me, and she's 20-something, I'm 55. So that may be a dynamic that comes into play to help us broaden our candidate pools as we deal with, you know, new technology that continues going forth and who has that expertise. So did I answer your question?
Yes, I just have a couple more. In your setup, you said that you pulled from companies that are publicly traded.
Yes.
Was there anything in the literature in particular, or just in your selection process of why only publicly traded companies versus companies that are not?
Well, you know, for one of the differences, of course, publicly traded companies are going to have to follow SEC guidelines, and so there's going to be a certain governance that's going to be more expected in the public entity space compared to in private organizations that aren't listed on stock exchanges. Mm-hmm. Having said that, actually, my participant pool got limited a little bit by this because one of the participants I approached that I think would be an ideal, it was my mistake that I thought she served on a public corporate board, and she didn't. And she came back to me and said, you know, I apologize, or I have to say, I don't think I meet your criteria because while the boards that I serve on, they do follow SEC guidelines. They're large private corporations. We're not a publicly traded company. So that actually gave me a little bit of a challenge, but of course she was one of the ones that exposed me to some other candidates that ultimately helped me flesh out my 12 participants. But that was one of my shortcomings where, you know, I just felt, well, a publicly traded company would ensure the best, the best boards, the best candidates, and would be the best consideration for this study just because of the importance of publicly traded organizations in our business environment. But that would, I should have really just said, if you follow SEC guidelines regarding your board governance, I think that would allow me to have went out into the private space, the private organization space, and had the same kind of quality of directors that was part of my dissertation.
Along with that, because they are publicly traded companies, typically they have some sort of diversity statement that the company follows. Mm-hmm. How did your participants address that or diversity statement? Like how that is that something they implemented themselves or had to implement themselves? Well, and how they feel like others follow that, that plan?
Yeah, I think given the variety of boards that I had, a diversity statement wasn't necessarily involved in some, but in others it was. And actually, one of the women participants noted that boards have to be intentional in having a diversity statement. And also, not only should their CEO in the organization have to follow that diversity statement, but the board itself should also follow the same diversity statement. So it did emerge from some of my participants' comments that how the diversity statements was one of the factors that could influence boardroom diversity. And then, of course, it was also recognized that that didn't necessarily come into play with other organizations, at least not at this time.
I guess I just want to follow in the footsteps of the other committee members and congratulate you, Kirk, on a really good presentation this afternoon and a very comprehensive study. And I know at times we talked about it being even more comprehensive at the start and actually trying to take out some components. And I think you've done a really good job of distilling your core themes. And I guess I just have a question for you. Trying to drill down a bit more into this intentional networks aspect. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that for the women, it was about having, or perhaps not having as expansive a network. So if you were to talk to a group of women this afternoon who are interested in board roles, and you're talking about having a more expansive network, I'm assuming that doesn't mean just adding names to the network.
Right.
Who do you think they should be targeting? And does it mean going out of their industry so that they're connecting with other players, perhaps in other sectors? Yeah, some comment about how you think they expand it.
Well, the intentionality, some of what when I say that, what I'm seeing in my mind when I say it is, my experience in networking is that I've seen women, particularly African-American women, if it's a little bit of a social activity, for example, here in Charlotte, Herb Gray is one who, when he has an event, it will just be completely packed with people. And you'll find a lot of people there. And not that you can't find what you're looking for if you're looking to be in the boardroom, but definitely that's more of a social type of networking. And you'll find a lot of what I think could be potentially great talent for the boardroom there, networking and having a great time. Versus, things that are more around the corporate board space and around that environment that's going to ensure that you have corporate board directors or influencers there. And one of my participants noted how he gets invited, or he was invited, and he was talking about attending some networking events for women, and how there may have been him and one or two other board directors who were there in a room or an area full of I think it was about 100 women. But the networking they were doing had to be intentional to make sure they were networking with the people in the boardroom and not just networking amongst themselves. Because he wasn't trying to be critical of women networking amongst women, but he was essentially saying, if you're trying to be in the boardroom and you want visibility to the boardroom, if you're not networking with people who are in that space, then that networking is not going to do you any good for the boardroom. So that's some of the intentionality is, as you're thinking about the events you may want to attend, is it more social, have fun, or is it going to be more business around the corporate board space? And then, of course, finding those opportunities and may take more effort than to find the social activity. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Thank you. And I guess we could argue the same thing from the corporate's point of view.
Yeah, there's the
so
flip
much
side.
of this is about what the candidate needs to be doing, but we can also see, right, that organizations need to be more intentional, and
Right.
so boards need to be thinking about how do they expand their networks.
And so if I'm in the boardroom, or if I'm looking to, for a director position that's coming open, I want to find the talent. If I go to where I always go, me being a white male, who's going to be there? Is it going to be people who look mostly like me and have my background, my experience? If I want to find that diverse talent, you need to go to the networking opportunities that have what I call a label in front of it. And when I say a label, I mean it's going to say Black or African-American, whatever, or it's going to say Hispanic or Latino, whatever. And if you go there, then that's when you're going to start finding more diverse talent. It could be the Black MBA or something like that. And if you go there, you're going to find some good quality people that you can consider, or at least, if nothing else, bring into your pipeline that can help eventually down the road that you can groom to be that corporate board option or that director option that you don't have today.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Are there any other comments or questions from the committee members? Okay, I'm being conscious of time, so I would open up to 2 questions or comment from the audience before we, the committee, put you all in a waiting room, the guests in a waiting room so the committee can caucus, and then we will return to announce the results of Kirk's final defense. So are there any questions or comments from one or two guests?
Let me just say one or two quick things. Kirk, congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Excellent job, for one. And then point two is the fact is that in my own experience, having sat on a couple of boards, but at the same time recognizing the fact, you can also, from your own experience, get in contact with firms such as Korn Ferry International and others that have the experience in terms of recruiting corporate board members. And they can institute various types of searches in terms of finding these folks, very qualified people, and then subsequently begin to establish that ongoing network at the same time. So I guess what I'm suggesting is the fact there are resources that I think they're already out there that we can expand the network, but also expand the opportunity through a variety of different firms in terms of maximizing that effort.
This is LaMonica Kirk. I just want to say congratulations. Great information. Enjoyed hearing what you had to share today.
Thank you.
All right. At this time, I am going to temporarily, I'm going to put the committee in a breakout room, and then we will return, okay?
Okay. Hear you. And hang on one second. Where's your mother at? You know, my family, they started doing different things. So hang on, let me get.
Oh, yeah, but make sure you gather everyone, because I'm ready to report the results.
All right, she's ready to report the results. So we'll make sure you can hear. I tell you what, let me make sure. Yeah, I got you wide open.
So is everyone back?
They are.
All right, Don Kirk Beatty, it is my pleasure to congratulate you as Dr. Beatty because you successfully defended your dissertation.
Thank you.
Woohoo! Excellent.
This was a great study. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your courage, right? I look forward to what you're going to do next. As I've told you, I'm going to give you a break this weekend. I'm not going to bother you, and we'll meet on Monday to debrief. So at this time, I want you to take your moment as Dr. Beatty and express any remarks that you choose to, and that will close us out for this meeting. Thank you all again, everyone, for joining, and Kirk, take it away.
Well, of course, I want to first thank my committee for being with me through this, and particularly you, Dr. Austin, for making sure you carried me across that line. You know, I couldn't do it without you. And of course, Dr. Gathers-Watley, as well as Opala and everyone else on the committee, thank you very much. And I also would like to express my appreciation to my colleagues, you know, A&T as a whole, all my professors. You know, I felt at home at A&T as I have anywhere, and I felt extremely welcomed and valued, and it's been a wonderful experience. The class experience was great. And Dr. Graves, as you know, I preferred to have those in-person classes, and that was part of the reason. Is the virtual classes just took me out of the mix too much, and I didn't feel that connectivity. So I chose A&T because I wanted to go to A&T and experience that as best I could. And actually, you know, I was actually planning on going to homecoming this year, which I haven't done yet because of all the work in the program. But I don't know what's going to happen in that space. I hadn't even looked there yet because, again, I was trying to finish up. So my colleagues, my professors, the entire A&T staff, you know, I really appreciate this. And then let me mention too, is my colleagues outside of A&T. I have several friends and colleagues who helped me kind of coalesce around what I was actually going to do and some of the comments. And of course, I've referenced that a little bit in my leading up, in the beginning of my dissertation. I mentioned some of those names. And then of course, let me take a moment, the group of 4 that are in the room with me right now. I have my mother that's, she's an example, as I said earlier, anyone who talks about they can't do things, she is an example of saying, don't give me any excuses. And of course, I have my wonderful wife who's been here with me the entire time, and she's allowed me to focus as I needed to on my dissertation. And you don't understand what I say when I mean that. And really the entire family, when I go back into my office space, they let me go back there. And they don't pull me, they don't complain about you not spending enough time doing this or that. They let me go do what I needed to do. And I remember, you may recall Dr. Graves in that interview, either you or Dr. Toms mentioned that you had to have your family behind you. Or I think it was one of you two, it may have been someone else, but you had to have your family on board with you doing this. And that's what you meant. And even though you may hear it, you may not truly appreciate it until you experience it. So I have a wonderful family, wonderful children that worked with me and allowed me to do what I needed to do for this program. So I have to thank them immensely. So, I could go on. As you know, I have a little bit of the gift of gab that I think I get most from my father, but I'll cut it short because we can continue these conversations. I tell you what, 5 o'clock is starting right here when Dr. Austin says it's 5 o'clock, and it will start, and y'all are more than welcome to find us. We're going to be initially in Mooresville. We're going to go grab something to eat, and then I don't know what else we're going to do today.
You buying?
I'm buying, so come on. You better catch me quick.
All right. All right. Well, congratulations. And I think we have to go now.
Yes,
Way to go.
committee members, I just sent you all an email.
Yeah.
And I look forward to your response. Kurt,
Yes.
enjoy yourself. It's 5 o'clock.
It's 5 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Y'all have a great afternoon. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah. Glad you mentioned your mother, Kirk.
Oh, yeah. I better. She's standing right here.
All right. Congrats, my brother. Talk to you later.
All right. Take care.
Kurt, I'll holler at you on Monday.
Okay. Look
Have
forward to
fun.
it. Uh-huh.